The mournful wail of a train whistle echoed across the barren Wyoming landscape as Colton Tucker urged his dun stallion forward through the driving rain. Blood trickled from a gash on his forearm, mingling with rainwater as it dripped from his fingertips. The thunderstorm that had gathered on the horizon now unleashed its full fury, turning the prairie trail into a muddy quagmire. Yet Colton pressed on, hunched beneath his sodden hat, his gaze fixed on the distant flicker of light that promised shelter. The year was 1875, and the untamed Wyoming Territory had already claimed too many good men. Colton had no intention of joining their number tonight. 2 years of driving cattle and dodging bullets as a hired gun had honed his instincts, and those same instincts now told him to seek refuge from the storm before hypothermia set in. The abandoned trapper's cabin he'd spotted from the ridge might offer sanctuary if he could reach it before the deluge washed away what remained of the trail. "Come on, Maverick," he urged, patting the horse's drenched neck. "Just a little further, boy." The stallion snorted, tossing his head against the rain as they approached the dilapidated structure. The cabin stood nestled against a small rise, its weather-beaten logs almost invisible against the darkening sky. No smoke rose from the chimney, a good sign that it remained unoccupied as Colton had hoped. He'd encountered enough desperate men in these parts to be wary of unexpected company. As he drew nearer, however, Colton's vigilance sharpened. The stallion's ears pricked forward, sensing something his rider had not yet perceived. Colton reached for the Colt revolver at his hip, wincing as his injured arm protested the movement. The wound, a parting gift from a card player who'd taken exception to losing his month's wages, wasn't deep, but the persistent bleeding concerned him. Through sheets of rain, he noticed something amiss. The cabin's door hung partially open, swinging gently in the wind. More telling was the fresh-cut firewood stacked neatly beside the entrance. Someone had been here recently. Colton dismounted carefully, keeping one hand on his pistol as he approached. The wind carried a sound that froze him in his tracks, a cry that was distinctly human. Not the shout of a man, but the agonized moan of a woman in distress. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his revolver, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The single-room cabin was sparsely furnished with a rough-hewn table, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Upon this bed lay a young woman, her face contorted in pain, her hands clutching her swollen belly. "Sweet Jesus," Colton breathed, holstering his weapon. The woman's eyes flew open at his intrusion, eyes the color of summer sage, wide with fear and pain. "Please," she gasped between labored breaths. "Please help me." Colton stood frozen for a heartbeat before instinct propelled him forward. He'd never delivered a baby, but he'd helped birth countless calves on his father's ranch before the war. The principles couldn't be that different, he reasoned, though the thought did little to steady his nerves. "My name's Colton Tucker, madam," he said, removing his dripping hat and coat. "I mean you no harm. Looks like you could use some assistance." The woman nodded, her sweat-dampened hair clinging to her flushed face. "Penelope," she managed. "Penelope Vance." Another contraction seized her and she cried out, gripping the edges of the thin mattress. Colton moved to her side, his own injuries forgotten in the face of her distress. He poured water from his canteen into a basin and rolled up his sleeves. "Where's your husband, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, searching for clean linens. "Dead," she replied flatly when the contraction subsided. "Indian attack. 3 months ago. We were heading to Oregon." Her breath caught as another wave of pain washed over her. Colton nodded grimly. He'd seen the aftermath of such attacks, whole wagon trains decimated, dreams of new beginnings buried in shallow graves along the trail. That she had survived at all spoke volumes about her fortitude. "I'll need to check how far along you are, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've never delivered a human baby before, but I've birthed plenty of livestock. With your permission." Penelope nodded, her face a mask of determination despite her obvious fear. "No choice now," she whispered. "This baby's coming with or without proper help." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Colton built up the fire, boiled water, and prepared as best he could with the limited supplies available. Outside, the storm raged on, lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, ghostly flashes that punctuated Penelope's cries. "You're doing well," Colton encouraged, though he felt wholly unqualified to make such an assessment. "Baby's head is crowning now. Next contraction, I need you to push with everything you've got." Penelope nodded weakly, her strength visibly fading. Her fingers sought his and he clasped her hand firmly. "I can't," she whispered after another exhausting attempt. "I'm so tired." "You can," Colton insisted, meeting her gaze steadily. "Your child needs you to be strong for just a little longer. I'm right here with you and I'm not going anywhere." Something in his voice must have reached her, for Penelope's eyes hardened with renewed determination. When the next contraction came, she bore down with a primal cry that seemed to rise from the depths of her soul. And suddenly, miraculously, a new cry joined hers, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Colton caught the slippery infant in his calloused hands, a lump forming in his throat at the sight of the tiny life now entrusted to his care. "A boy," he announced, his voice rough with emotion. "You have a son, Mrs. Vance." He wrapped the squalling infant in the cleanest cloth he could find and placed him on Penelope's chest, her exhausted face transformed, radiant with love as she gazed at her child. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Colton turned away, suddenly conscious of intruding on this sacred moment between mother and child. He busied himself with tidying up, acutely aware that his presence in the cabin was a chance occurrence that had he chosen a different path, or ridden through the storm instead of seeking shelter, Penelope might have faced this ordeal alone. The thought was unbearable. When he turned back, Penelope was watching him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. The baby had quieted, nestled against her breast. "Thank you," she said simply. "We would not have survived without you." Colton nodded awkwardly, unused to gratitude. "Just happened along at the right time, I suppose." "Providence," Penelope murmured, stroking her son's downy head. Colton moved to the door, peering out at the relentless storm. "Rain's not letting up. I'll tend to my horse and gather more firewood. You both need warmth and rest." Before Penelope could respond, he slipped outside into the downpour. In the relative privacy of the lean-to shelter where he'd stabled Maverick, Colton allowed himself a moment of weakness. He leaned against the rough wooden post, trembling not from cold, but from the weight of responsibility that had suddenly descended upon his shoulders. He delivered a baby, a tiny, helpless human being with nothing but instinct and determination to guide him. Now a vulnerable woman and her newborn son were depending on him, at least until morning. The realization both terrified and steadied him. When he returned to the cabin with an armload of wood, Penelope had dozed off, the baby secure in the crook of her arm. Colton added logs to the fire, careful not to disturb their rest. In the dancing firelight, he studied them, the young mother with her copper-gold hair spread across the pillow, and the infant with his miniature features still scrunched from the ordeal of birth. They looked so defenseless, so alone. Colton sank into the cabin's only chair, wincing as the movement reminded him of his own injury. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound needed cleaning. He rolled up his sleeve, examining the jagged cut by firelight, You're hurt." Penelope's voice startled him. She was watching him through half-lidded eyes, concern evident in her gaze. "It's nothing," Colton replied, hastily rolling down his sleeve. "Just a scratch." "Let me see," she insisted, her voice stronger than he expected. "It's the least I can do after what you've done for us." Colton hesitated, then conceded. He approached the bed, extending his arm for her inspection. "This needs stitching," she declared after examining the wound. "There's a sewing kit in my pack by the door, and whiskey, if you have any, for cleaning." "You should be resting," he protested. "I can rest and stitch at the same time," Penelope countered. "I've had plenty of practice tending wounds. My father was a doctor in St. Louis before we headed west." Recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw, Colton retrieved her sewing kit and produced a flask of whiskey from his saddlebag. He sat on the edge of the bed as Penelope threaded a needle with practiced ease. "This will hurt," she warned, pouring whiskey over the wound. Colton hissed through clenched teeth but remained still as she began her work. Her stitches were neat and precise, betraying her claimed experience. "What happened?" she asked, her attention focused on her task. "Disagreement over a card game in Laramie," Colton admitted. "The other fellow thought I was cheating." "Were you?" The directness of her question surprised him into honesty. "No, madam, I don't need to cheat to win at cards." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "And the other man, did he fare worse than you?" "He'll live," Colton said flatly. "Though he might think twice before pulling a knife on a stranger again." Penelope tied off the last stitch and cut the thread with small scissors from her kit. "There. Keep it clean and it should heal without festering." "Thank you," Colton said, rolling down his sleeve. "Now you really should rest. Both of you need it." As if on cue, the baby stirred, his tiny face screwing up in preparation for a cry. Penelope lifted him, cradling him close and murmuring soft reassurances. "Does he have a name?" Colton asked. Penelope hesitated, gazing down at her son. "James," she decided, "after my father, James William Vance." "A fine name," Colton agreed. "Strong." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the steady drumming of rain on the cabin roof. Colton moved to make a pallet for himself on the floor, but Penelope's voice stopped him. "Mr. Tucker," she began hesitantly. "I have no right to ask anything more of you, but—" She faltered, pride warring with necessity. "Ask," Colton encouraged gently. "I can't stay here alone," she confessed, the words seeming to cost her greatly. "Not with a newborn, not in this wilderness. The nearest settlement is Independence, 2 days' journey from here, and her voice broke. "I have nowhere else to go." Colton studied her, noting the fear she tried so valiantly to conceal beneath a veneer of composure. Here was a woman who had already endured more than most could imagine the loss of her husband, a perilous journey alone in her condition, and now childbirth in the most primitive of circumstances. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "Mrs. Vance," he said solemnly, "I give you my word that no harm will come to you or your son. When you're strong enough to travel, I'll escort you to Independence. Until then, I'll stay and help however I can." Relief flooded her features, though she made an effort to mask it. "I can pay you," she offered. "I have some money saved." Colton shook his head firmly. "This isn't about money." "Then why would you help us?" she asked, a note of wariness creeping into her voice. "You don't know me." "A fair question," Colton acknowledged silently. "Why indeed?" He was a drifter, a man who avoided entanglements and responsibilities. He'd spent 2 years riding alone, taking whatever jobs came his way, answering to no one. Yet something about this woman and her child called to a part of him he'd thought long buried apart that remembered what it meant to belong somewhere, to someone. "Let's just say I've spent too long looking out for only myself," he finally replied. Maybe it's time to remember there are things in this world worth protecting. Penelope held his gaze, searching for something in his expression. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, for she nodded once, decisively. "Thank you," she said. "We accept your protection, Mr. Tucker." "Colton," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my given name." "Colton," she repeated softly. "And I'm Penelope, Penny to my friends." The baby James chose that moment to announce his hunger with an insistent cry. Colton tactfully retreated to the door, giving Penelope privacy as she nursed her son. "I'll keep watch outside for a spell," he said. "Call if you need anything." The rain had finally slackened to a gentle patter. Colton stood beneath the cabin's small overhang, watching as the clouds began to part, revealing a sky brilliant with stars. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, clean and fresh after the storm. Inside that weathered cabin lay a new mother and her infant son, both alive because of his intervention. The weight of his promise settled on his shoulders not as a burden, but as a mantle of purpose. For the first time in years, Colton Tucker felt the stirring of something that resembled hope. As dawn broke over the Wyoming wilderness, Colton tended the fire and brewed coffee from his meager supplies. Penelope slept fitfully, waking every few hours to nurse James before drifting back into exhausted slumber. Colton took the opportunity to assess their situation with clear-eyed practicality. The cabin, though rudimentary, offered reasonable shelter. Game was plentiful in the surrounding woods, and a small creek flowed nearby, providing clean water. They could remain here for a week or more, allowing Penelope to recover her strength before attempting the journey to independence. However, their supplies were limited. Colton's saddlebags contained only basic provisions: jerky, coffee, hardtack, and ammunition for his rifle. Penelope had even less: some dried fruit, a small sack of cornmeal, and a few personal belongings salvaged from her interrupted journey west. Making a mental inventory, Colton stepped outside to check the weather. The storm had cleared entirely, leaving behind a sky of pristine blue. He unsaddled Maverick, allowing the stallion to graze in the small clearing beside the cabin. The horse had earned his rest after their harrowing ride through the storm. As he worked, Colton considered his options. There was a trading post about half a day's ride south, where he could obtain necessary supplies. But leaving Penelope and the baby alone, even for a day, seemed unwise. Predators, both animal and human, roamed these parts, and in her weakened state, she would be defenseless. His deliberations were interrupted by Penelope's voice calling from inside the cabin. He found her attempting to rise from the bed, one arm cradling James protectively. "You shouldn't be up yet," Colton admonished, rushing to her side. "I need to move," she insisted, though her pallor and trembling limbs belied her words. "I can't lie abed all day." "You gave birth less than 12 hours ago," he reminded her. "Most women would be confined to bed for at least a week." "Most women aren't alone in the wilderness," she countered, wincing as she tried to stand. Colton sighed, recognizing the stubborn determination that had likely kept her alive this long. "At least let me help you," he said, offering his arm. With his support, Penelope managed to walk slowly to the table, where she sank gratefully onto a rough-hewn bench. James remained nestled in her arms, sleeping peacefully. "That's better," she said, though her face was drawn with pain. "Now I can feel useful again. Is there coffee?" Colton poured her a cup, noting with concern how her hands shook as she accepted it. "We need to discuss our situation," he said, taking the seat opposite her. "Our supplies won't last more than a few days." Penelope nodded, her gaze clear despite her exhaustion. "I have a proposal," she said. There's a homestead about 5 miles east of here. I passed it on my way to this cabin. The family, the Hansons, seemed kind. They offered me shelter, but I was too proud, too determined to make it to Oregon as my husband and I had planned." She looked down at James, her expression softening. "I didn't know how close I was to my time. By the time I realized my mistake in refusing their help, it was too late to turn back." "You think they'd be willing to assist us now?" Colton asked. "Mrs. Hanson has 7 children of her own," Penelope replied. "When she saw my condition, she practically begged me to stay. I believe they would help, yes." Colton considered this. 5 miles is too far for you to travel today, but I could ride there, explain the situation. Perhaps they could spare supplies until you're strong enough to make the journey." Relief washed over Penelope's features. "Would you? I hate to impose further, but—" "No imposition," Colton interrupted firmly. "I gave my word to protect you both, and that includes ensuring you have what you need to recover." Penelope studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Tucker Colton," she corrected herself. "And what did you expect?" he asked, curious despite himself. "When you first appeared in the doorway, gun drawn and blood on your sleeve, I thought my final hour had come," she admitted. "You looked dangerous." "I am dangerous," Colton acknowledged quietly, "to those who mean harm to others. But not to a woman in childbed or to a newborn," she observed. "Even the most hardened outlaw draws the line somewhere, Mrs. Vance." His tone was light, but something in his expression made Penelope tilt her head consideringly. "Are you an outlaw, Colton?" The directness of her question startled a laugh from him. "No, madam. Just a cowhand between jobs. I've driven cattle from Texas to Montana and most places in between. Tried my hand at prospecting for a spell, but the gold fever didn't take with me. And before that," she pressed. "You mentioned your father's ranch." Colton's expression shuddered. "That was another life, before the war." Understanding dawned in Penelope's eyes. "You fought for the Union." "Illinois 7th Cavalry," he confirmed shortly. "But that's ancient history now." Sensing his reluctance to elaborate, Penelope changed the subject. "If you're to ride to the Hansons today, you should know what supplies we need most urgently." They compiled a list: clean linens, food staples, medicinal herbs if available, and Colton prepared to depart. Before mounting Maverick, he made sure Penelope was comfortable, with water and his loaded rifle within reach. "Bolt the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more so you'll know it's me returning." Penelope nodded, cradling James close. "We'll be fine," she assured him. "Go safely, Colton." The ride to the Hanson homestead took longer than anticipated. Maverick picked his way carefully through terrain still muddy from the previous night's downpour. By midday, Colton spotted the smoke from a chimney rising above the trees, and soon after, a neat homestead came into view. The main house was solidly built of hewn logs, with outbuildings arranged in a practical semicircle. Fields of wheat stretched to the east, and a small orchard of apple trees flanked the western approach. It was a prosperous-looking establishment, tended with evident care. As Colton rode into the yard, a boy of about 12 ran from the barn to greet him, followed by a tall, broad-shouldered man Colton presumed to be Hanson himself. "Good day to you, stranger," the man called, his accent betraying Scandinavian origins. "What brings you to our door?" Colton dismounted, introducing himself and explaining Penelope's situation. At the mention of her name, Mrs. Hanson emerged from the house, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "The expectant widow," she exclaimed. "She has had her child, then, and both are well." "A healthy boy," Colton confirmed. "Born last night during the storm. They're sheltering in a trapper's cabin about 5 miles west of here." The Hansons exchanged glances laden with concern. "That old place is barely fit for humans," Mr. Hanson said grimly. "Roof leaks something terrible and the chimney draws poorly." "It was shelter enough for the birth," Colton replied. "But Mrs. Vance needs proper care now. She's too weak to travel far and our supplies are limited." Mrs. Hanson was already moving toward the house. "Eric, hitch the wagon," she called over her shoulder. "Prepare the guest room. I'll gather what we need for a new mother and infant." Her husband nodded, turning to Colton. "We'll bring them here," he stated as if the matter were already decided. "No argument, young man. A new mother and babe need more than a leaky cabin can provide." Colton found himself unexpectedly relieved by their response. The responsibility of caring for Penelope and James had weighed on him, though he'd never have admitted as much. Within an hour, the wagon was loaded with supplies, including a feather mattress, clean linens, and baskets of food. Mrs. Hanson, who insisted Colton call her Ingrid, climbed aboard with determined efficiency. "My eldest daughter will mind the little ones," she explained as her husband helped her onto the seat. "I have brought into this world 12 children of my own and helped birth many more for neighbors. I know what your Mrs. Vance needs now." "She's not my Mrs. Vance," Colton corrected, feeling heat rise to his face. Ingrid merely smiled, her weathered face crinkling with knowing amusement. "As you say. Now shall we depart? Daylight wastes." The return journey seemed interminable to Colton, who found himself increasingly anxious about Penelope and James. Had they remained safe in his absence? Was the baby faring well? Had Penelope attempted to do too much too soon, injuring herself in the process? His concern must have shown on his face, for as they neared the cabin, Eric Hansen remarked, "You care for them already, I think." Colton did not reply but urged Maverick ahead to announce their arrival. At the cabin door, he knocked the agreed-upon pattern. When no response came, his heart lurched painfully. He knocked again, louder, calling Penelope's name. The door swung open slowly, revealing Penelope holding James close, the rifle balanced awkwardly in one arm. Relief flooded her features at the sight of him. "I fell asleep," she admitted, lowering the weapon. "I'm sorry if I frightened you." "As long as you're both safe," Colton replied, surprised by the intensity of his relief. "I've brought help. The Hansons insisted on coming." Ingrid bustled past him, her experienced eye taking in Penelope's pallor and trembling limbs. "You should not be standing, young woman," she chided gently. "Back to bed with you while we prepare to move you to more suitable quarters." Too exhausted to protest, Penelope allowed herself to be guided back to the bed, where Ingrid proceeded to examine both her and the baby with professional efficiency. "The child is perfect," she pronounced, rewrapping James in clean linens she'd brought. "And you, my dear, are stronger than you look, but you need proper care now, good food, rest, and a comfortable place to recover." "I don't wish to impose," Penelope began. "Nonsense," Ingrid interrupted briskly. "We Hansons do not leave women and children to fend for themselves in the wilderness. It is decided. You will come to our home until you are fully recovered." Outside, Colton helped Eric prepare the wagon, creating a comfortable nest of blankets and the feather mattress. "Your wife is formidable," he observed. Eric chuckled. "You have no idea. 26 years of marriage and I have won perhaps 3 arguments. But her heart is as vast as the prairie, and twice as generous." When all was ready, Colton gently carried Penelope to the wagon, conscious of her slight weight in his arms and the trust implicit in the way she allowed herself to be held. James, secure in Ingrid's experienced hands, was settled beside his mother once she was comfortably arranged. The journey to the Hanson homestead was slow and careful. with Eric guiding the horses around every bump and hole in the trail. Colton rode alongside, vigilant for any sign of danger. Though this part of the territory was generally peaceful, Penelope dozed fitfully, waking whenever the wagon hit a particularly rough patch. During one such moment of wakefulness, she caught Colton watching her. "You've gone above and beyond your promise," she said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," he replied honestly. "I'm glad I found you when I did." "As am I," she murmured, her gaze holding his for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgment, perhaps, of the unusual circumstances that had bound their fates together. The Hanson homestead was a hive of activity upon their arrival. Children of various ages emerged from the house, curious about the newcomers. Ingrid dispatched them efficiently, the older girls to prepare the guest room, the boys to help their father with the wagon and horses. Colton carried Penelope inside, following Ingrid to a small but comfortable bedroom at the rear of the house. Clean sheets, fresh wildflowers in a mason jar, and a cradle, clearly a family heirloom, awaited them. "My great-grandmother's," Ingrid explained, noticing Penelope's gaze on the intricately carved cradle. "All my children slept in it, and now it will serve yours until you are ready to continue your journey." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes at this simple kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve such generosity from strangers." "We are strangers no longer," Ingrid declared firmly. "Now, you will rest while I prepare a strengthening broth. Your cowboy can keep watch if it eases your mind, but in this house, you are safe." With that, she ushered Colton from the room, though not before he saw the flush that colored Penelope's cheeks at the words, "your cowboy." In the Hanson kitchen, Colton found himself surrounded by curious children, all eager to hear the tale of the storm, the birth, and his role in these dramatic events. Eric shooed them away after a few minutes, offering Colton coffee and a seat at the large family table. "You've had quite an adventure," he observed, settling across from Colton. "What are your plans now?" The question caught Colton off guard. He'd been so focused on immediate concerns, Penelope's safety, the baby's well-being, obtaining supplies, that he hadn't considered the future beyond escorting them to Independence. "I promised to see Mrs. Vance and her son safely to town," he replied slowly. "After that, I suppose I'll look for work. Cattle season's coming up." Eric nodded thoughtfully. "And the widow, what are her plans?" "I don't know," Colton admitted. "She mentioned Oregon, but that was her plan with her husband. Now with the baby." He trailed off, realizing how little he actually knew about Penelope's circumstances or intentions. "A woman alone faces hard choices," Eric said soberly, "especially one with a newborn child." The implications of his words settled heavily on Colton's shoulders. Independence was a rough frontier town, not an ideal place for a woman in Penelope's position. What would become of her and James once he fulfilled his promise and rode away? The question haunted him as the days passed at the Hanson homestead. Penelope recovered her strength gradually, spending progressively more time out of bed each day. James thrived under the joint care of his mother and Ingrid, whose expertise with infants proved invaluable. Colton made himself useful around the homestead, helping Eric with repairs to the barn roof and joining the older boys in hunting game for the family table. In the evenings, he found himself drawn to the guest room, where Penelope often sat in a rocking chair by the window, James cradled in her arms. Their conversations during these quiet moments ranged widely from Penelope's childhood in St. Louis as the daughter of a respected physician, to her marriage to William Vance, a school teacher with dreams of establishing a school in Oregon Territory. She spoke of their journey west, the hardships and moments of beauty they'd shared, and finally, with halting words, of the attack that had taken her husband's life. "We were separated from the main wagon train," she explained, her voice steady though her eyes reflected old pain. "William thought we could make better time on our own. We were attacked at dawn. I never even saw how many there were. William told me to run, to hide in the ravine while he held them off." She paused, her fingers gently stroking James's cheek. "I heard the shots. When I dared return hours later, he was gone. They'd taken the wagon, our horses, most of our supplies, but they didn't find me or the small pack of valuables I'd managed to grab before fleeing." "How did you survive after that?" Colton asked gently. "One step at a time," Penelope replied. "I walked until I found a homestead where they gave me shelter for a few days. Then another and another. People are kind mostly when they see a pregnant woman in distress. Eventually, I reached this area and—" She smiled faintly. "You know the rest." In return, Colton found himself sharing pieces of his own past growing up on an Illinois farm, his service during the war, and the restlessness that had driven him west afterward. He omitted certain details, the nightmares that still plagued him, the faces of men he'd killed in battle, the reasons he avoided putting down roots. Yet something about Penelope's quiet strength and resilience made him want to be worthy of her trust. Each evening, he found himself revealing more than he'd intended, drawn by her genuine interest and lack of judgment. On the 7th day of their stay, Colton ventured into Independence to purchase supplies and gather information. The town was exactly as he remembered it, a single dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, the inevitable saloons doing brisk business even in the early afternoon. At the general store, he selected items from the list Ingrid had provided, adding a few extras he thought might please Penelope: a small jar of honey, a length of soft blue ribbon, a tin of lemon drops. As the shopkeeper wrapped his purchases, Colton casually inquired about opportunities for a woman with a new baby. "Depends on the woman," the shopkeeper replied shrewdly. "If she's respectable, the hotel might need help with laundry or cooking. If not—" He shrugged eloquently. "She's a widow," Colton said sharply. "Highly respectable, educated." "Ah, well, that's different. Mrs. Patterson at the schoolhouse was just saying they need another teacher come fall. Enrollment's up with all the new families settling hereabouts." Colton filed this information away, thanked the man, and continued his errands. At the livery stable, he learned that a cattle outfit was indeed hiring for a drive to Cheyenne, due to start in 2 weeks' time. The pay was fair, the trail boss reputable. It was exactly the sort of opportunity he would normally seize without hesitation. Yet as he rode back to the Hanson farm, Colton found himself oddly reluctant to commit to the job. The reason for his hesitation became clear as he crested the final hill and saw Penelope sitting on the farmhouse porch, James in her arms, her copper-gold hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. Something twisted in his chest, a longing so intense it bordered on pain. In just over a week, this woman and her child had become important to him in ways he couldn't articulate. The thought of leaving them behind while he drove cattle to Cheyenne felt increasingly wrong, though he couldn't logically explain why. That evening, after the Hanson family had retired for the night, Colton found Penelope alone on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. James was finally sleeping through most of the night, giving her rare moments of solitude. "I brought you something from town," Colton said, producing the small jar of honey. Penelope's face lit up with pleasure. "Real honey. It's been months since I've had any. Thank you, Colton." The genuine delight in her expression warmed him more than the thanks. He settled beside her on the porch step, his shoulder nearly touching hers. "I also heard the school in Independence might need a teacher," he offered. "The shopkeeper mentioned enrollment is increasing." Penelope turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "Teaching was William's profession, not mine. But I did assist in his classroom in St. Louis, and I certainly have the education for it. It would provide a steady income," Colton pointed out. "A respectable position, perhaps housing as well." "You've been thinking about my future," she observed softly. Colton nodded, suddenly uncertain under her searching gaze. "It's not my place to plan your life," he acknowledged. "But I promise to protect you and James, and that includes ensuring you have options beyond charity." She supplied when he faltered. "You deserve more than just getting by, Penelope," he said earnestly. "You and James both." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze lifting to the star-strewn sky. "When William died," she finally said, "I continued west because I couldn't think what else to do. Our dream had been Oregon, so I fixed my mind on reaching it, as if completing the journey could somehow preserve a part of him." She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "But Oregon was his dream more than mine, and now there's James to consider. A stable home, a community, access to a doctor." She sighed softly. Independence might indeed be the sensible choice. Relief flooded through Colton, though he tried not to examine too closely why the prospect of Penelope settling nearby affected him so strongly. "There's also a cattle drive to Cheyenne starting in 2 weeks," he mentioned casually. "Good outfit, fair pay." "And you'll be joining it?" Penelope asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I haven't decided yet," Colton admitted. "What's holding you back?" "Isn't that the sort of work you've been doing?" It was the perfect opening to express the confusion he felt, the growing reluctance to resume his solitary existence, the unexpected attachment he'd formed to her and James, the dawning realization that his life might have room for more than just the next job, the next town, the next temporary diversion. But the words wouldn't come. Years of guarding his emotions, of keeping people at a distance, had left him ill-equipped to articulate such vulnerable truths. "Just weighing my options," he said instead. "No rush to decide." Penelope nodded, though something like disappointment flickered across her features. "Well, I appreciate your concern for our future," she said, rising from the step. "It's getting late and James will be awake for his feeding soon." Colton stood as well, acutely aware of having missed an opportunity, though he couldn't have said exactly what that opportunity was. "Good night, Colton," Penelope said, pausing at the door. "And thank you for the honey and for thinking of us." Before he could respond, she had slipped inside, leaving him alone with the night and his tangled thoughts. 2 days later, Ingrid pronounced Penelope fit to travel to Independence. "Though I would gladly keep you and the little one here longer," she added. "Our home is yours for as long as you need it. You've done more than enough," Penelope insisted, embracing the older woman warmly. "I can never repay your kindness, but I promise to pass it forward whenever I can." The Hansons provided a wagon for the journey, insisting they could spare it until Penelope was settled. Eric would drive, with Colton riding alongside as an additional escort. As they prepared to depart, Ingrid drew Colton aside. "That young woman has steel in her spine," she said without preamble. "But even steel can break if bent too far. She needs more than just a safe arrival in Independence." "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Mrs. Hanson," Colton replied, though he suspected he did. Ingrid fixed him with a knowing look. "I have watched you with her and the baby. The way you look at them when you think no one notices, the care you take with both of them." She patted his arm kindly. "A man does not need to be blood kin to be family, Mr. Tucker," Remember that." Before Colton could formulate a response, she moved away to help Penelope settle James for the journey. The trip to Independence passed uneventfully. Eric's steady driving and frequent stops ensured Penelope's comfort, while Colton remained vigilant for any sign of trouble. By mid-afternoon, they reached the outskirts of town. Independence had grown considerably since its early days as a jumping-off point for pioneers headed west. Now it boasted a proper hotel, several churches, a schoolhouse, and the usual assortment of businesses catering to the needs of both settlers and travelers. Their first stop was the hotel, where Colton secured a room for Penelope and James while Eric waited with the wagon. The hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Donovan, took one look at Penelope with her infant and instantly softened. "We have a quiet room at the back," she assured them. "Away from the street noise with a rocking chair by the window. My Albert will carry your things up." Penelope thanked her, then turned to Eric. "I don't know how to begin thanking you and Ingrid," she said earnestly. "You've shown me that there is still kindness in this harsh land." "You will do the same for others when the opportunity arises," Eric replied simply. "That is how we survive out here, by helping one another." With a final round of thanks and promises to visit, they bade him farewell. Eric would spend the night at a cousin's farm outside town before returning home the next day. Once settled in her room, Penelope insisted on visiting the schoolhouse immediately. "I need to know if the teaching position is actually available," she explained. "Everything depends on finding work quickly." Colton escorted her to the neat white building at the edge of town. James, drowsy after the journey, slept peacefully in his mother's arms as they approached the schoolhouse steps. Mrs. Patterson, the head teacher, proved to be a formidable woman of about 50, with steel gray hair and penetrating eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She received them in her small office, listening intently as Penelope explained her circumstances and qualifications. "You have actual teaching experience?" she inquired, scrutinizing Penelope as if assessing a specimen under glass. "I assisted my late husband in his classroom in St. Louis for 3 years, Penelope replied steadily. "I am proficient in all the standard subjects and can teach music as well." "And the child?" Mrs. Patterson glanced at James, who had awakened and was regarding her with solemn blue eyes. "My son will not interfere with my duties," Penelope assured her. "By the time the school term begins, he will be 2 months old. I can arrange care during teaching hours." Mrs. Patterson drummed her fingers on her desk, clearly deliberating. "We normally wouldn't consider a woman with a newborn," she admitted. "But qualified teachers are scarce, and your background is impressive." She named a salary that, while modest, would cover Penelope's basic needs. "The position includes lodging in the small house behind the school," she added. "It's not luxurious, but it's clean and weathertight." "When would you need my decision?" Penelope asked. "Take a day to consider," Mrs. Patterson replied. "The term doesn't begin until September, but if you accept, you could move into the house immediately. It stands empty at present." As they left the schoolhouse, Colton could see the mixture of hope and anxiety on Penelope's face. "It sounds promising," he offered. "It does," she agreed. "The salary is less than I'd hoped, but with housing included." She adjusted James in her arms, wincing slightly at the strain on muscles still tender from childbirth. "Here, let me," Colton said, gently taking the baby. James settled against his chest with surprising ease, tiny fingers curling around the edge of Colton's vest. Penelope watched them, a soft expression crossing her features. "He trusts you," she observed. "Babies are good judges of character, they say." Colton looked down at the infant in his arms, marveling at the perfect miniature features and the implicit trust in the way James relaxed against him. A surge of protectiveness swept through him, so powerful it momentarily took his breath away. "I think you should accept the position," he said as they walked back toward the hotel. "It's respectable work, provides housing, and gives you and James stability." "You sound as if you've given this considerable thought," Penelope remarked, glancing at him curiously. "I have," Colton admitted. "I want to know you'll both be secure." They had reached the hotel, but instead of entering, Penelope guided him to a bench beneath a cottonwood tree in the small town square opposite. "Sit with me a moment," she requested. "We need to talk." With James still cradled in one arm, Colton sat beside her, suddenly apprehensive about what she might say. "You've kept your promise and more," Penelope began, her voice gentle but firm. "You found me in my hour of need, delivered my son, and ensured our safety. You've helped secure a potential position and housing for us. By any measure, your debt, if ever there was one, is paid in full." Colton frowned. "This isn't about debt." "Then what is it about?" Penelope challenged softly. "Why have you delayed joining the cattle drive? Why do you continue to hover at my side when I am now perfectly safe in town?" The directness of her questions left no room for evasion. Colton looked down at James, finding it easier to address the sleeping infant than meet Penelope's searching gaze. "Because I care what happens to you," he finally said, the words inadequate to express the complex emotions churning within him. "Both of you. As a friend, a protector, or something else," Penelope pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Colton raised his head, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I don't know," he admitted truthfully. "I only know that the thought of riding away, of never seeing either of you again, sits like lead in my gut." Something softened in Penelope's expression. "Colton," she said gently, "I have lost too much to risk misunderstanding. If you care for us as a friend, I am grateful. But if there is more, if you feel even a fraction of what I have begun to feel for you, then I need to hear it plainly." Her candor stunned him into momentary silence. Had she just implied that she had feelings for him? This educated, courageous woman who could surely do better than a drifting cowhand with a troubled past. "I'm not the kind of man who should be around a woman like you," he said hoarsely. "You deserve someone stable, respectable. Not someone who spent years running from his own shadows." "Perhaps I should be the judge of what I deserve," Penelope countered. "I've seen enough of you to know your character, Colton Tucker. You may present yourself as a drifter, but when it mattered most, you stayed. You helped. You protected." She reached out, her fingers lightly touching his where they cradled James. "That speaks louder than any past you're running from." The simple touch of her hand sent warmth spreading through Colton's chest. James stirred between them, making small, snuffling sounds that heralded his hunger. "He needs feeding," Penelope said, taking her son from Colton's arms. "And you need time to think about what you truly want. I won't pressure you, Colton, but I won't wait forever either. James and I need to build our lives, whatever form they take." With that, she rose and entered the hotel, leaving Colton on the bench with thoughts more tangled than ever. That night, in his small room at the boarding house across town, Colton paced restlessly. Penelope's words echoed in his mind, challenging him to confront the feelings he'd been avoiding. The truth was, in the 2 short weeks since he'd found her in that cabin, Penelope Vance had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead: the capacity to care deeply for another person, to envision a future beyond the next job or town. And James, holding that tiny boy, witnessing his first moments of life, had stirred protective instincts Colton hadn't known he possessed. The thought of being part of the child's life, of watching him grow, filled a void Colton hadn't even recognized existed within him. But could he be what they needed? A husband to Penelope, a father to James. His own father had been a hard man, quick with criticism and sparing with affection. The war had further hardened Colton, teaching him to suppress emotions that might interfere with survival. What did he know of family life, of constancy and tenderness? Yet Penelope had seen something in him worth trusting, worth loving, if he dared interpret her words correctly. And perhaps that faith, more than any qualification he might lack, was what mattered most. By dawn, Colton had reached a decision. He washed and dressed with care, then headed to the general store where he made a small but significant purchase before continuing to the hotel. Mrs. Donovan informed him that Penelope was breakfasting in the small dining room. He found her at a corner table, James sleeping in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a dresser drawer lined with blankets. "May I join you?" Colton asked, hat in hand. Penelope nodded, her expression guarded as she gestured to the chair opposite her. "Have you eaten?" "Not hungry," he replied, taking the seat but leaving his hat on the table, fingers nervously turning the brim. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." "And?" Penelope prompted when he fell silent. Colton took a deep breath. "I'm not good with words," he warned. "Never have been. But I need to try for both our sakes." He met her gaze steadily. "When I found you in that cabin, I was just passing through another town, another job, moving on as I always have. I never thought I could feel this way again." Penelope's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "These past 2 weeks have shown me what I've been missing," Colton went on. "Not just companionship, but purpose, meaning. When I hold James, when I see you with him, I feel anchored in a way I haven't since before the war." He reached across the table, hesitantly covering her hand with his. "I can't offer you wealth or a distinguished name. I'm just a cowhand who's seen more trouble than triumph. But if you'll have me, I'd like to stay. To be part of your lives, yours and James's, in whatever way you'll allow." Penelope turned her hand beneath his, intertwining their fingers. "Are you proposing, Colton Tucker?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice despite the tears shimmering in her eyes. "Inelegantly, but yes," he admitted with a rueful smile. "Though I should warn you, I've never done this before." "Nor have I received such an offer before," she replied. "My marriage to William was arranged by our families, though we grew to care for each other deeply." She studied their joined hands. "If I accept, you should know what you're getting. I'm stubborn, opinionated, and fiercely protective of those I love. I will not be a meek, silent wife who defers in all things." "I would expect nothing less," Colton assured her. "Your strength is part of what I admire about you, Penelope. And you should know that James will always come first," she continued. "His welfare, his happiness, those must be our priorities." "As they should be," Colton agreed. "I may not be his blood father, but I brought him into this world. I already care for him as my own." Penelope's expression softened. "Then yes, Colton Tucker, I accept your proposal, inelegant as it may be." Joy surged through Colton, momentarily robbing him of words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a simple silver band, not an engagement ring, but a token he hoped would symbolize his commitment until he could provide better. "It's not much," he said apologetically as he slipped it onto her finger. "But it's a promise, a beginning." "It's perfect," Penelope assured him, examining the band with evident pleasure. "A new beginning for all of us." James chose that moment to awaken, announcing his hunger with increasing urgency. Penelope laughed, rising to collect her son. "Already asserting his place in the family," she observed. Family. The word resonated in Colton's chest, filling spaces he hadn't known were empty. As he watched Penelope soothe the infant, he felt a certainty that had eluded him for years. This was where he belonged, not on endless dusty trails or in anonymous saloons, but here, with this woman and this child. "I'll need to speak with Reverend Hawthorne at the church," he said, already planning their future. "And we should look at the teacher's house, make sure it's suitable for all three of us." Penelope smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her face. "I think Mrs. Patterson might be surprised to learn her new teacher will be arriving with a husband as well as an infant." "Will it cause problems?" Colton asked, suddenly concerned. "On the contrary," Penelope assured him. "A married teacher will be considered more respectable than a widow alone. And having a man about the place will be seen as an advantage, someone to maintain the property, perhaps help with the older boys when discipline is required." Relief washed through him. "Then I'll find work locally," he decided. "No more long cattle drives or drifting from town to town." "Are you certain?" Penelope asked, searching his face. "I would never ask you to give up the life you've known if it brings you satisfaction." "It never did," Colton admitted. "I was running, not living. Now I have a reason to stay in one place, 2 reasons," he corrected, gently stroking James's downy head. Their wedding took place 3 days later in the small white church at the edge of town. The ceremony was simple, attended only by Mrs. Donovan from the hotel, Mrs. Patterson from the school, and the Hanson family, who made the journey specifically for the occasion. Penelope wore a dress Ingrid had helped her alter, sky blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. James, dressed in a christening gown that had clothed generations of Hanson babies, slept peacefully in Ingrid's arms throughout the brief service. As Colton placed a proper gold band on Penelope's finger, purchased with most of his remaining savings, he was struck by the improbable journey that had led him to this moment. From a storm-tossed night in a leaky cabin to a wedding in a sunlit church, his life had transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hawthorne declared. "You may kiss your bride." Colton bent to claim his first kiss as a married man, his heart swelling as Penelope's lips met his with a sweetness that promised many such moments to come. The small house behind the schoolhouse quickly became home. Though modest in size, with just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small parlor, it offered everything the new family needed. Colton spent his first weeks of marriage making improvements, repairing the roof, building shelves and a proper cradle for James, clearing the overgrown garden for Penelope to plant vegetables and flowers. Mrs. Patterson, initially skeptical about a former cowhand as the schoolteacher's husband, was won over when Colton volunteered to repair the schoolhouse steps and build new desks for the expected influx of students in the fall. His carpentry skills, learned from his father and honed during the war when building defensive structures, proved unexpectedly valuable in their new life. By mid-August, Colton had secured steady employment with Mr. Donovan, the hotel owner who also operated a freight business serving the surrounding area. The work maintaining wagons, managing stock, and occasionally driving shipments to nearby settlements allowed him to be home most evenings with his new family. James thrived under the joint care of his parents. At 6 weeks old, he had begun to smile responsively, a development that reduced the stoic Colton to a state of wonder the first time those tiny lips curved upward at the sound of his voice. "He knows you," Penelope observed, watching them from the kitchen doorway. "He recognizes his father." Father. The word still caught Colton by surprise, though he embraced the role with increasing confidence. Each night, he took his turn walking the floor with James when he fussed, singing the same lullabies his mother had sung to him as a child, melodies he'd thought long forgotten. As summer yielded to early autumn, Penelope began preparing for the school term. Each evening, she pored over books and lesson plans while Colton sat nearby, James often sleeping on his chest as he read the newspaper or whittled small toys for when the boy was older. These quiet domestic scenes healed something in Colton that had been broken since the war. The nightmares that had plagued him for years grew less frequent, replaced by dreamless sleep beside the woman he now loved with a depth that sometimes frightened him. For her part, Penelope blossomed in her role as both mother and teacher. The school term began successfully, with 23 students of varying ages enrolled. She returned each afternoon tired but fulfilled, eager to share stories of her pupils' progress and antics. Their first real challenge as a married couple came in October, when a fever swept through Independence, affecting many children and some adults. James, not yet 3 months old, developed a worrying cough and lethargy that sent fear coursing through both parents. For 3 days and nights, they took turns holding their son, sponging his tiny body to reduce the fever, administering the herbal remedies Ingrid had taught them. When James's breathing became labored, Colton rode through the night to fetch the doctor from a neighboring town. "Pneumonia, doctor," Wilson diagnosed grimly after examining the infant. "It's severe, but he's a strong boy. Keep doing what you're doing. The fever must be controlled, and he needs fluids even if he seems reluctant to nurse." The next 48 hours were the longest of Colton's life. He watched Penelope's strength and composure waver for the first time since he'd known her. Her face etched with fear as James's condition worsened before finally stabilizing. When the crisis passed and James began to improve, Colton found Penelope weeping quietly in their bedroom, her shoulders shaking with the release of pent-up terror. "He's going to be fine," Colton assured her, gathering her into his arms. "The doctor says the worst is over." "I thought we might lose him," Penelope whispered against his chest. "After everything, finding you, starting this life together, I thought fate might still take him from us." "Not while I have breath in my body," Colton vowed fiercely. "I promised to protect you both, and I meant it then as I mean it now." Penelope raised her tear-stained face to his. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly, "for finding me that night, for delivering our son, for saving both our lives." "You don't need to thank me," Colton replied, stroking her hair. "You gave my life purpose when I had none. That's a greater gift than I can ever repay." As winter settled over Independence, their small home became a haven against the harsh Wyoming weather. Colton ensured they had ample firewood, made repairs to keep out drafts, and even constructed a small sleigh to transport Penelope to the schoolhouse on snowy days. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations that Colton observed with bemused interest. Penelope transformed their modest home with pine boughs, red ribbons, and candles, insisting that James's first Christmas, though he was too young to remember it, should be properly celebrated. "My family always made it a special time," she explained as she hung stockings by the fireplace. "Even during the war, when supplies were scarce, my mother found ways to create magic." Colton had few pleasant memories of Christmas. His father had considered such celebrations frivolous, and after his mother's death when he was 12, the holiday had passed largely unobserved in the Tucker household. During the war, Christmas had been just another day of cold, hunger, and danger. Yet seeing Penelope's joy as she prepared for the holiday awakened a desire to embrace these traditions not for himself, but for her and James. He secretly carved a set of wooden animals for his son, and with Mr. Donovan's help, ordered a special gift for Penelope from a catalog. On Christmas Eve, they attended the service at the small church, now decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. James, resplendent in a new outfit Ingrid had sent, was passed admiringly among the congregation, who had embraced the young family as their own. Later, as they sat before the fire in their home, James sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Colton presented Penelope with a small package. "It's not much," he said, echoing his words from the day he'd proposed. "But I saw it and thought of you." Penelope unwrapped the parcel carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal with her initials stamped in gold on the cover. "Oh, Colton," she breathed, "it's beautiful." "I noticed you writing in that tattered notebook each night," he explained. "Your thoughts, observations about James, ideas for your teaching. I thought you deserved something proper to contain them." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes as she traced the embossed letters. "It's perfect," she assured him. "The most thoughtful gift I've received." She rose to retrieve a package of her own, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "For you," she said, placing it in his hands, "though it's not nearly as fine as what you've given me." Colton unwrapped the gift to find a knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the even stitches. Penelope nodded. "I worked on it during James's naps. Blue to match your eyes," she added with a shy smile. "Do you like it?" "It's the first Christmas gift I've received in more years than I can remember," Colton admitted, wrapping the scarf around his neck despite the warmth of the room. "And certainly the most precious." He drew her close, kissing her with a tenderness that still surprised him that he, Colton Tucker, once known for his quick temper and quicker gun hand, could feel such gentle emotion. "I have one more gift," Penelope said when they parted, "though it won't arrive for some months yet." Colton looked at her quizzically, not comprehending until she placed his hand against her still flat stomach. "Another baby," he whispered, astonishment and joy surging through him. "You're certain?" Penelope nodded, her face glowing with happiness. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. Around June, he thinks. James will have a brother or sister before his first birthday." Colton gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were made of the finest porcelain. Another child, a sibling for James, their family growing in this home they had made together. "Are you pleased?" Penelope asked, searching his face. "Beyond words," Colton assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought I'd have any of this: a wife, children, a home. You've given me more than I ever dared hope for." Penelope Tucker. As the fire crackled and James slept peacefully nearby, Colton reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a storm-tossed night to a Christmas Eve filled with love and promise, his life had transformed completely. He had ridden into that cabin a solitary man, carrying the weight of his past and little hope for his future. He had emerged a husband and father, with responsibilities that sometimes terrified him, but also filled him with purpose and pride. "What are you thinking?" Penelope asked, nestling against his side. "About that night in the cabin," Colton replied honestly. "How close I came to passing it by, seeking shelter elsewhere. How different our lives might have been if I hadn't heard your cry." "I believe it was meant to be," Penelope said softly. "That in all the vastness of this territory, you were guided to that place, at that moment, for a reason." Colton wasn't sure he shared her faith in divine intervention, but he couldn't deny the extraordinary sequence of events that had joined their lives. Whatever force, chance, fate, or providence had brought him to that cabin door, he would be forever grateful. "I love you," he said simply, the words still new enough to feel momentous each time he spoke them. "You and James and this little one to come. Whatever the future holds, we'll face it together." Penelope smiled up at him, her expression reflecting the certainty he felt. "Together," she agreed. "Always." Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing Independence in pristine white. But inside their small home, warmth and hope prevailed, a family forged in unlikely circumstances, bound by love that had grown from a promise made on a stormy night when a cowboy found a woman giving birth alone in a cabin. delivered her baby, and vowed to protect them both. A promise Colton Tucker would keep for all the days of his life.